Hey there, welcome to our htmlCSS lecture on semantic elements. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to learn. We're going to learn the HTML5 semantic structure tags to help us build a web page. So we're going to start with a little bit of history. Prior to HTML5, which came out in 2014, we pretty much had divs and spans. Some people used p tags, but you can see how confusing things got. So this is what our web page looked like. We had these div tags that were doing our block level elements. So I had my div at the top, which had my logo and my navigation in it, and then I had a div for my main, and then that had some other pieces inside of it, and this was all floating to the right. And then, of course, down at the bottom, I had my div that stored my footer information. So it was a lot of divs, and it got fairly confusing when you were sorting through someone's code. So in 2014, when HTML5 came out, um, the creators decided that they were going to add some new elements, elements that work just like div tags. They're block level elements that don't have any pre-formatting, but they're going to be named elements for what people use most often. So we're going to go through these elements one at a time. We're going to start with the header element. So the header element, not to be confused with the document head or with the heading tags, the header element is what we typically see at the top of a web page. It typically has the company's logo. It has some navigation, might have login information or search information, but that header is at the top of our document. Um, Again, it's typically at the top of the page. Doesn't have to be typically at the top of the page. And general rule of thumb here is that it should be less than about 100 pixels because otherwise it starts to take up too much of the page. So you'll see in this case, it's just sitting at 60 pixels high because the image is 60 pixels high. Okay, so that's the first one, the header tag. The next element then is the nav tag because most websites have some kind of navigation on them. So the nav tag, again, replacing watch back. It was a div tag here, now it becomes a nav tag there. The nav tag is there to replace that div to be a little more um, descriptive in what is stored inside of it. Okay, the next tag we have is the section tag, and you'll see that we've got that set up here. So I'm keeping this main div, and then that's my main, and then inside of that, I'm setting sections, breaking the page into pieces. Um, so again, looking back and coming forward, we're just taking those two inner div tags and turning them into section tags. The next one that we have is called an aside tag. You see this a lot in textbooks. You're kind of reading down the page, and then over on the right side of the page, there is an aside, some information related to the content, not really as important. Um, so we can make an aside. Now, the aside tag by itself doesn't do anything. I might as well have written section, div, header, or nav there. But by labeling it as an aside and then styling it with a float right, it pushes it over to the side of the page, and again is a little more descriptive of what it is. And then the last one I'm going to talk about, not that this is the only ones that there are, but the last one I'm going to talk about is the footer page. Again, we go back and forth watching the bottom of this code. It goes from div to footer. The footer is typically used at the bottom of the page. Often there's copyright information, there's contact information. This should really be kept to a minimum. This one I've got set at 50 pixels. We don't want the footer to be too big, again, taking up really big page real estate. So let's take a look at these side by side now. You'll see what it looked like on the left in the old, and you'll see in the right in the red what it looks like in the new. And by using these semantic tags, header, section, aside, footer, nav, and others, that we can really make it clearer what our intent is. It will also, in the long run, make styling easier than having all those divs. But we'll talk about that in our next lecture when we talk about internal styles. Okay, so one of the things that happens here is we have all these block level elements, and we want to kind of put some space around them. And so we need to deal with what's called margins and padding. So let's take a look at that. So I have this element, and the element is shown by this border between the blue and the pink. So I have an element, and that element has some content in it. And by an element, maybe it's a header tag, a div tag, uh, a nav tag, a footer, whatever. So I've got some element, and that element has some content in it. The distance between the element border and the content is what we call padding, and the distance between the element border and other elements on the page is what we call margin. So inside the borders of the element is space is padding, outside the borders of the element space is margins. Um, so we're going to talk about a variety of different margin and padding rules that we have here. And I'm going to talk about them in terms of margins, but anything that I do here for margin will also work for padding. So the first one is I write margin 5px. And what that does is it sets all four sides, top, right, bottom, and left, to 5 pixels. Second option, I write margin 5px space 10px. The 5 is going to apply to the top and the bottom. The 10 is going to apply to the left and the right, always starting with the top. Our next option, if I do this, I set the top to 5. The 10 represents the left and the right, and then the 15 represents the bottom. And then finally, I can set them all specifically this way by saying 5, 10, 15, 20. Starting at the top, going clockwise, it's top is 5, right is 10, bottom is 15, left is 20 pixels. So we go around that clockwise from the top. That's if I want to set them all at the same time. If I want to set some of them individually, I can also do that. We have an action, a style called margin top, setting just the top margin. And then, of course, it follows suit that there is margin right, margin bottom, and margin left. And so in this case, that fourth line that says margin 5, 10, 15, 20 is a shorthand to do the 4 lines below it. And again, all of these same rules work for padding. For example, if I wrote padding 5px, 10px, that would give top and bottom padding of 5 and left and right padding of 10. Let's look at some examples here. So I created a couple of sections here. The first section has a background color of black, and it's got a margin of 10 pixels. And so you'll see on all sides of that black section at the bottom, there's 10 pixels of space, both top, left, bottom, and right. My second section, which is the green one, has no margins or padding. And the third section, which is the blue one, does not have margins, but it has padding, and you can see the difference there between a margin of 10 pixels on the black and a padding of 10 pixels on the blue. The padding gives us space inside of the element. The margin gives us space outside of the element. Okay. Um, so the last thing then that I want to talk about is controlling layout here with CSS display. So there's a display property in CSS that lets us treat things, call them block or inline. A block level elements, as we discussed, are full width. They have a line break before and after them, like a div. Inline elements, like a span, are just the width of their content with no breaks. But I can't do margins and padding on spans. I can only do them on block level elements. In the cases where we want an element to act inline but be able to access block level styles, we change the CSS display property to inline block, right? And that gives us kind of the best of both worlds. So let's take a look at how this might shake out. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a bunch of spans, and I'm going to give them some. Well, let's just create them first, and I'll just call it S1, S2, S3. That should be enough to get the point across, and we'll see what they look like. So they come right across because these are inline elements. If I come in here and I give them some styles, things like style equals margin, and we'll do 5 pixels top and bottom, 10 pixels left and right. And I'm going to give it a background color of black and a color of white. I'm going to take that same style and I'm going to apply it to all three spans. Nothing really changes here. I did get some margins to work a little bit, but it's not really doing what I want. Now, if I come in and I change these to all have a display of block, that's going to make this span act like a div. So what happens is they'll end up on different lines. I want to be in the middle of that. I want to be in a situation where I can control these block level styles, but I want them to be in the same line. So instead of doing block here, we're going to do inline block, inline block, inline block. And when I do that, I get this set up, but the difference now is that I can give each of them a width of 100 pixels. I give them each a width of 100 pixels. Now I've got this really great setup. And I could, of course, text align them in the center. And now I've got something that's really starting to form. Maybe 10 pixels between them is a little too much. Let's just go to 3 pixels between them, just to give us a little bit of space between them horizontally. Right, and so now I'm starting to get what looks like a really nice navigation bar, or buttons or sections in a web page. If I give each of these a height as well, let's say that I make them all 100 wide, but I make them all 250 pixels high. Now that becomes really interesting. I get these nice blocks on my page. And maybe I want to fill them with content, or maybe I want to fill them with images, or maybe I want to fill them with images and content. But that works whether these are spans or divs or sections. If I turn all my spans into sections here, because of the inline block display style, they're all going to act the same way. So there's literally no change when I refresh it after I've changed all of my spans to sections. So that display property becomes really useful to us, especially when we use the value for display of display inline block. That's really great stuff. A little bit of review, so some HTML tags we talked about: header, nav, section, aside, footer. Article is another HTML semantic tag that is out there. I don't use it often, but it's something that you can use. And then we talked about some CSS styles: margin, padding, display. So now it's time for you to practice. Create 2 paragraphs of text. You can either make them up or use an online text generator tool, put them in a section. Then in that section, create an aside that will float to the right of the screen. The aside should have some text and should have bottom and left margins of 10 pixels with 5 pixels of padding on all sides. The background color of this side should be yellow with a 3-pixel black solid border. Take a second, give that a shot, and then come back. Okay, let's move on. Look at the solution for this. So you see that I start with my section, and then here's my 2 paragraphs. I've shortened them because of space, separated by BR tags. Here's my aside, just like when I want to take an image and I want it to float to the right. The image has to be first. If I want an aside to float to the right, that aside has to be first. And then I just gave it all the styles it needed. Float right, padding 5 pixels, margin bottom 10, margin left 10, background color of yellow, and a border of 3 pixels solid black. This is a side text. It's related to the text on the page, but not as important. I hope this helps. I hope you enjoy working with the semantic tags and that they help you in your web design. We'll see you next time in lecture 5 when we talk about internal styles. Thanks. See you next time.